So, as you have just heard, I am interested in virtuosity, which I define in my work as skill made apparent and socially meaningful. It's skill that matters, such that it becomes an explicit locus of value. I developed this definition to accomplish several things, but its most immediate purpose was to undercut the assumption that virtuosity is inevitably about superlatives, the fastest, the loudest, the most of whatever kind. If you listen closely to discourses and displays of skill, which is what I've done a lot of over the last 10 years, what you find is that many virtuosities have nothing to do with such superlatives. Of course, every definition has its weaknesses. In fact, definitions by definition have their weaknesses because definitions tend to take whatever ambiguity is resolved and place at least a piece of it in some other term. That is, of course, the case here. What I found is that the word skill can be misleading when I talk about it with folks, and that they easily can mistakenly take it to mean sheer ability. So I must also emphasize at the start that, as anthropologist Tim Ingold makes clear, skill is more a dynamic relationship than an individual capacity, more about the perception of and adaptation to the environment than the simple transformation of it. Philosopher Hubert Dreyfus similarly prefers to speak not of skill alone, but of skillful coping. The terminological shift, among other things, emphasizes that we engage with the world on unsteady terms. We do not shape reality from without, creating matter and bestowing meaning from above. We cope from within. We negotiate meaning. These things may ring to some of you like scholarly truisms, which they are, but they are also true, not just in general terms, but of the process of academic labor itself. We are thrown, to use the existentialist term, into a social world of which our fields and subfields are but a small part, and we learn to navigate them even as they begin to shape us. From the time we are graduate students, we are told to make a contribution to the field, but that productive act is, especially at first, an act of coping, one that we hopefully perform with some degree of skill. So let me get specific. 2 brief examples as prologue. I found myself, when I first started this work, like most graduate students, thrown into the state of my topic. Scholarship on virtuosity and music studies has long been dominated by models drawn from the 19th century, particularly the example of pianist Franz Liszt. Musicologist James DeVille, himself a respected Liszt scholar, has dubbed this the Liszt problem, and I'm grateful to him for it. Even studies that make no reference to Liszt, in distant genres, from jazz to heavy metal, frequently follow this implicit model of masculinized, sublime virtuosity. So I coped. Even before DeVille had named the Liszt problem for me, I sensed its effects. My early attempts at studying 21st century virtuosities felt somehow groundless. But as I sought out relevant literature and concepts, I found that I ended up gesturing vaguely toward the 19th century. The scholarship on that period, to be clear, was and is excellent. I do not blame them. But these tools made for Parisian salons were at times ill-suited to the culturally and historically distant situations that interested me. Increasingly, 21st century virtuosities seemed impossible to interpret without filling in the gap and considering 20th century virtuosities on their own terms, which must, among other things, include thinking about the centrality of mediation. My forthcoming book, which Harry has spoken about so kindly, arose from a desire to fill that gap. In it, I make space for the Lisztian model as simply one virtuosity amongst many, not as a paradigm for the phenomenon in its entirety. And much of the book focuses on largely forgotten virtuosities from 20th century American popular culture. But let's get more specific. Recently, I was thrown into the state of my own writing project. In the summer of 2024, I received a grant from the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities to complete my book, but my plans for the remaining chapter fell through. And so again, I coped. I had funding, time, no real disciplinary proscriptions to hold me back, and nothing to lose. So I decided to try something in the final body chapter of the book that I had avoided everywhere else. Rather than seeking out evidence of other people's experiences of virtuosity, I turned to my own mediated encounters, which is what I will present to you today. As I began navigating this new scholarly register, I found myself pairing first-person phenomenology with critical voices from music and media studies in a way resembling what media scholar Abigail de Kosnik calls personal theory. De Kosnik advocates for this combination of first-person narrative with theoretical arguments because, she argues, it suits our historical, technological, and cultural moment. I would add that from my perspective, personal theory suggests a degree of intellectual humility, one that is especially necessary when writing of online experiences. Our atomized digital lives make it increasingly difficult to know whether or to what extent any experience is held in common. I share the online environments I navigate with many people, but we are frequently anonymous to one another, uncertain where we came from or where the other is going. And at the same time, I'm also never alone in these environments, as algorithms constitute a kind of presence that hovers at the edge of my awareness while playing a tremendous structuring role in that experience. Although there are a range of valuable methods for studying digital culture, and many ways that online environments adapt to each of our individual actions and histories, the clearest way forward, the one chosen here, is to speak for myself in hopes that I may stumble onto some common ground in the digital darkness. On any given day, over 122 million people access YouTube. Presumably some of you are on it right now, which is odd. Yeah, hi YouTube, I'm on you, I'm talking about you. There are many reasons one might join this throng. Maybe a friend sent a link via message or email, or perhaps someone or some corporate entity shared a video on social media. On one particular day last year, I came to the platform thinking of Kaki, a musician I first saw on television in December 2004 on The Late Show with David Letterman. YouTube itself was launched just 6 months after that performance, and the footage was posted for the first of many times a little more than a year later. My initial search for King brings up that Letterman performance, and I'm struck by the fact that YouTube's ever-expanding online repository has made it possible for me to stumble with little effort onto a television clip I casually enjoyed 20 years ago. It almost seems meant to be this media reunion, but I'm drawn to something else. I'm drawn to a new video, a more recent one, featuring King playing a piece called The Surface Changes. It's not immediately clear to me why I've selected this video, but I suspect it comes down to visual appeal. The thumbnail image is intriguing, even a bit perplexing. It shows King in a very dimly lit room in front of a well-aged brick wall holding a guitar that is luminescent, aglow with the image of a thundercloud in an otherwise bright blue sky. The audiovisual richness of the video beckons, but before I click play, before I can even imagine what forms this next virtuosity might take, the platform and its algorithmic nudgings and underpinnings have already molded my experience. The very possibility of being drawn to a particular video depends on its position in the search results, and The Surface Changes was fortunately one of the first. Few things are simultaneously mundane yet opaque to us as the internet search bar, but it's clear that whatever algorithmic interventions occur between these few strokes of my keyboard and the long list of options I peruse is enormously consequential for my eventual viewing experience. Search engines are functioning constantly as technologies of attention that both reveal and conceal. What I might think of in passing as a tool of access is also always a tool of exclusion, one that allows us to blind ourselves to the distractions inherent to the web in order to focus attention on a relatively small handful of pages that the search engines assure us are most applicable to the topic at hand. Any of the virtuosities I might encounter through streaming are always already taking shape in relation to the digital architecture of this environment. So in this talk, I'm going to examine virtuosity in the context of streaming practices by exploring 3 common paths for engaging online video content. First, I can simply view a single video, be amazed, and move on to a different task. This is decidedly not what YouTube is built to encourage. It is the least desirable path from the standpoint of the platform, the content creators, and advertisers, but it's perfectly plausible given a bit of discipline or time constraints. I call this the path of only what I came for. Second, I can engage in what I call accelerated fandom, utilizing YouTube, social media, and other online outlets to amass a wide array of media texts and paratexts about a particular artist in the span of mere minutes or hours. Or third, I can surf the algorithm, taking its recommendations and watching a slew of videos that I curate in tandem with the platform's nudging. In what follows, I explore these paths separately for the sake of clarity, but it is exceedingly common for them to weave together in a way that many of you would no doubt find familiar. What begins as a search for specific content quickly becomes a more widespread engagement with a particular artist or an hour lost to indiscriminate streaming. Now, in attributing a structuring power to streaming media at the outset, I do not intend to drift into any straightforward technological determinism. I explore 3 different, if frequently overlapping paths, precisely because we retain some agency in this process, and there are no doubt many additional paths we might take. At the same time, scholarship on digital architecture consistently demonstrates that it exerts influence in much the same way that physical architecture does. And the algorithms operating behind online interfaces thus exercise a social power that we regularly experience, even if their technical workings elude us. As my talk will demonstrate, that social power ultimately contributes to simultaneous intensifications and crises of value, alternately scattering and amplifying our focus. At times, the algorithms almost seem to care for me, obviating the very attention that serves as the primary economic driver of this online ecosystem. So path 1, only what I came for. When I click on the surface changes, I find King playing in a way typical of many guitarists, sometimes grouped under the heading of contemporary or modern fingerstyle. There are other names thrown around. This style is performed generally by solo guitarists who utilize techniques of finger picking, two-hand tapping, and percussive approaches to the instrument. At the start of this video, however, the technique is more intentionally limited, even austere. King sets the strings in motion simply by hammering on and pulling off with the fingers of her left hand. This is how she plays the entirety of the opening, meaning for the first 15 seconds or so, her right hand hangs motionless at her side. Take a viewing here. The music here largely conforms to my genre expectations. I am, after all, a guitarist who came of age with the internet, and I've done this for a while. The visuals, however, are a marked departure from them. The technique of contemporary fingerstyle lends itself to a choreographed, theatrical presentation. Musical and gestural flourishes abound as hands fly, drawing sounds from the instrument in unexpected ways. Guitarists in this genre generally very obviously perform both emotional and musical labor in tandem, working hard to emote or at least convey meaning through their bodily comportment as they play. Even if they don't engage in the easily mocked contortions of what Phil Auslander calls guitar face, you could all turn to your neighbor and make your best guitar face if you want a moment of levity. No? Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate a little audience participation. Even if they don't do that, they usually sport a look of concentration, pensiveness, involvement, something. But there is no hint of that here. King appears dressed head to toe in white, and any expression I or anyone else might read on her face is obscured by very large, also white sunglasses. The absence of any movements beyond those strictly necessary for sonic production is arresting, even unnerving. As you heard after the first iteration of the piece's primary riff, the lights fade and a series of straight lines appear on King's guitar, morphing into various shapes that give the illusion of depth through their intersection. The song is part of an audio-visual project called The Neck is a Bridge to the Body, in which the guitar itself is precision mapped as a backdrop for a visual spectacle projected upon it. As she begins adding percussion with her right hand, the shapes intensify into something resembling lightning before flaking away, leaving a projection of a far more traditional acoustic guitar. Later, oceans, microscopic organisms, schools of fish all flash upon the instrument. The spectacle of virtuosity has been rejected and then relocated onto the instrument itself. Returning to the video's sonic properties, the sparse two-voice texture that begins the surface changes might not be what you expect in a discussion of virtuosity. And indeed, it's not particularly impressive from a purely sonic standpoint, but the appreciation of King's skill depends upon a partial awareness of how she produces these sounds. And I've argued this extensively in a piece about virtuosity and disability and guitarist Tony Melendez. Although the piece ends by accelerating into a climactic finish that bears many of the classic hallmarks of virtuosity, YouTube comments about her amazing use of the guitar as a percussive instrument, as well as the harmonic tapping, clearly reference the first half of the song, as the conclusion includes none of this percussive playing. It might initially seem to us that King's approach in this piece is a strictly necessary path to aesthetic ends, but I would argue there remains an element of arbitrariness to her technical choices. We might first ask, why play solo in the first place? There are certainly economic and practical motivations for doing so. A single body makes the logistics of scheduling and turning a profit easier than it would be with a large band. But if economic reasoning can explain why King elects not to have a percussionist or second guitarist ease the load of her musical labor, she could also achieve very similar, if not identical, outcomes with the use of another relatively simple and affordable technology, that of a digital looping pedal, thereby outsourcing some of the labor to her feet and the pedal's circuitry. Live versus lute performance is not necessarily a question of aesthetics, or at least not aesthetics in the narrow sense. The layered percussion and repeated riff that make up much of the surface changes bear similarities to other performers who layer multiple tracks of harmonies, bass lines, and percussion parts with the aid of such a looper. So if there are other less demanding ways to produce the sounds that comprise the surface changes, and these might be just as aesthetically pleasing or almost as aesthetically pleasing as the means she employs, why not make use of them? I go into this in more detail in the book, but the simple answer really is that she and her audience would not consider these alternative approaches the right way of making this music. The action is aesthetically effective, to be sure, but it is also understood in some ways to be good, a commendable use of human creative energy. Let's move to path 2. After enjoying a single video, I decide to take advantage of a remarkable affordance of the modern internet and engage in what I call accelerated fandom. Because of the vast number of recordings, videos, texts, and paratext accessible online, I can go from casual listener to full fanatic in the span of an afternoon or two. Such accelerated fandom was always possible, or it was possible at least prior to the internet, but the conditions had to be perfect. In the right record store, seeking out the right artist, and with plenty of cash on hand, there might be a wide variety of recordings and articles and merchandise that would allow the type of fast-paced familiarization and appreciation that I describe here. But today, accelerated fandom is an ever-present option presented to us. This rapid-fire familiarization frequently takes the form of bricolage. As I stream videos, I concoct a poorly paced concert film. As I read interviews and paratexts, I cobble together a digital fanzine of her quips and other fans' responding comments. Streaming can thus produce an ad hoc variety show, but because it's unlikely that anyone will string together these videos in exactly this way again, including myself, the pseudo-artifact is in some ways a pseudo-performance. Each individual clip remains its repeatability, but for practical purposes, the sequence has lost this basic affordance of recording technology. I begin my accelerated fandom by learning more about the project that the Surface Changes is part of, and I quickly find a short video discussing the inspiration behind it. At the start of the video, the project's grand scope is stated in text overlay. The neck is a bridge to the body, lays bare the guitars, capital letters, inner life and protean power, the instrument serving as an ontological tabula rasa in a creation myth unlike any other. This begins to place the images from the Surface Changes into a narrative rather than synesthetic register. All the images of nature and movement, was this the world coming into being? Well, there's no time for that question. I have to move on. It is almost impossible to seek out material about Kaki King without quickly encountering some of the touchstones of her reception, which came in 2007 when she was the only woman named in Rolling Stone's list of the new guitar gods. David Frick wrote then, quote, "King is a genre unto herself, punctuating her acoustic fingerpicking with fret hammering and slap bass funk, a gripping hybrid of Michael Hedges, Eddie Van Halen, and Bootsy Collins." This is an odd compliment. And I find on further searching that King agrees. Although she has great respect for these musicians, she muses that a combination of them would produce a, quote, funk metal shredder bastard. End quote. Indulging further in my accelerated fandom, I find that King was not interviewed for this article, and she sometimes seems to enjoy making fun of it. At the same time, being the only woman granted status as a guitar god from a prominent publication has provided a compelling biographical bullet point and quick proof of her relevance ever since. The same year that Rolling Stone sang her praises, Foo Fighters frontman Dave Grohl made another comment that has lived on and been just as widely repeated. There are some guitar players that are good, and there are some guitar players that are really fucking good, and then there's Kaki King. It's not surprising that these early endorsements continue to remain front and center in later pieces of media, but it is odd how often these same pieces imply that King is still somehow being discovered. Still, it makes my experience of accelerated fandom feel more exciting. Here we are, at the vanguard. If the speed and ease of accelerated fandom are its most notable qualities, one of the strangest aspects of the experience is the way that the chronology of the content is often obscured or at least de-emphasized. It seems the search algorithms that I'm engaging with are interested in more in popularity than recency, but this is at best a hunch. As media scholar Michelle Wilson points out, many of the algorithms we encounter daily are proprietary owned and thus opaque and inaccessible to outside critique. Nonetheless, their workings have wide-ranging consequences for the shape and direction of our everyday lives. Wilson's observation makes me feel for the first time a tinge of paranoia. I start to wonder, just how organic is this accelerated fandom? When I start looking more closely at the dates of various articles and videos, one of the biggest differences that I notice between King's reception today and 15 to 20 years ago is the role of gender. Whereas it was once widely remarked upon, gender seems to be less of a point of emphasis in more recent interviews. In a world where we increasingly recognize the foundational role of Willie Mae, Big Mama Thornton in rock and roll, and when St. Vincent is one of the most prominent guitarists in popular music, perhaps we've moved beyond the purported novelty of a woman playing guitar and doing it particularly well. But it also seems that audiences have been aware, still prodded on no doubt by various paratexts that persist with unusual vigor on the internet, that King does not possess what musicologist and disability studies scholar Blake Howe calls the guitar's standard performance body. Although she appears able-bodied and is thus normative in that respect, articles and interviews, especially early on, regularly emphasized that her gender and her short stature were ostensibly surprising qualities for such an accomplished musician. Like so many virtuosos, she can be presented as a rarity, perhaps even a singular musical talent, just as Frick's genre unto herself designation indicates. On to another video. This time, a live clip from a 2008 TED conference where King began her set with her highly percussive playing with pink noise. The YouTube video's description again promotes King's original claim to fame. Quote, Kaki King, the first female on Rolling Stone's Guitar God list, rocks out to a full live set at TED 2008. Jaw-dropping virtuosity meets a guitar technique that truly stands out. The performance begins, however, not with technical displays, but with a philosophical prologue. And I quote King, "I was thinking about my place in the universe." This launches a brief discussion of her childhood thoughts on time and infinity that culminates in an existential crisis of sorts. If time stretches on infinitely, then, quote, every point in time is really infinitely small and therefore somewhat meaningless. She resolves the crisis by reversing the perspective, noting that if every moment is infinitely small, that means all moments are equal. And in that way, quote, every moment really is the most important moment that's ever happened, including this moment right now. And so therefore, this music you're about to hear may be the most important music you'll ever hear in your life, end quote. I will say, from my perspective, King comes off as reflective enough to have truly entertained these thoughts, and affable enough to not sound self-obsessed or insincere. She smiles as she declares her performance the center of all meaning in the universe, and the audience laughs appreciatively, to my ear at least, not dismissively. This grand introduction was first made to the live audience at the event, but it also captures something of the implicit hopes as I engage in this accelerated fandom, clicking on each new video. None bring me directly to the moment of performance, but neither do they function as mere records of prior events. My concern with them is not primarily epistematic or dogmatic. I do not feel compelled to watch and acknowledge or even believe what I have seen and heard. Instead, to draw on Theodore Adorno's metaphor of the virtuoso as a martyr, I find positioned to witness them, to realize each video's potential and affirm its importance through my own presence. YouTube provides an informal, documentary feeling of being there. Hello again, YouTube. I won't do this every time, but once more, hi. Such that witnessing performances through media can take on the status of an event. But as I formulate these thoughts, I realize this does capture one important aspect of my experience of watching King, yet it misses a great deal. For much as these videos might call me to witness, they are also constantly pointing my attention elsewhere. This is partially a result of the multi-sided media market created by YouTube and theorized by Patrick Wickstrom. Older forms of media participated in generally two-sided markets. Broadcast radio, newspapers, or network television all had to balance the interests of consumers on one side with those of advertisers on the other. But digital media introduces, as Gene Burgess and Joshua Green put it, a wide array of users with diverse interests contributing to and extracting value from the core product and service at different points. I would take their insight even further. It's not just that participants extract different value from the core product in different ways, but that stakeholders frequently hold entirely different views about what counts as the core product, or if such a thing even exists. This ambiguity about what constitutes this core can be partially explained by the ascendance of the asset over the commodity in online economies. The difference between these two economic entities' differences are substantial. Whereas commodities are tangible goods for consumption by others, assets are immaterial, light, and mobile, but also tied to the bodies, skills, and subjectivities of the laborers of these laborers. One purchases and disposes of a commodity as one sees fit, but digital creators provide access to an asset that they leverage without fully releasing ownership over it. As media scholar Kylie Jarrett argues, the driving force of digital life, at this moment at least, is assetization, not commodification. Assetization is further accompanied by what we might call advertification. The asset is constantly used to promote itself and related assets. Each video serves not as a commodity, music made into product that circulates for sale, but as leveraged asset and constant advertisement. In this network, value becomes so diffuse that it begins to resemble King's description of infinite time. Each video may take on the status of a profoundly meaningful event, but this very fact allows those same videos to simply defer that potential endlessly, directing me deeper and deeper into the network of assets and adverts. To paraphrase King, if every video is equally meaningless to me, as an asset in another's portfolio, or a mere advertisement, a paratext in an unending string of paratexts, then each video may also be the most important thing I will ever experience. The meaning that many seem to find in these videos is that of inspiration. On the YouTube video of King's TED performance, for example, when some commenters claim to appreciate her techniques, but to be unimpressed by the music itself, one user stepped in to shift their focus inward. The true ability in a musician is their ability to inspire others. This is in some ways a product of the genre expectations that viewers familiar with a TED Talk would bring to the experience. But as Adorno suggests, the roles of spectator and virtuoso can become blurred in the ritualistic atmosphere of virtuosity. As he writes, quote, "In a concert, as in our dreams, the actors in the right may exchange their roles. Frequently, we may no longer know who is being sacrificed, the work, the virtuoso, or ourselves." If this happens in a concert hall where strict protocols of behavior clearly maintain the boundaries separating audience and performer, streaming media, with the camera's intimate approach to the musician and my own intimate relationship to the technologies on which I view it, may be even more conducive to this type of reversal. The third path. One of the algorithmically sorted top comments on Kaki King's The Surface Changes video comes from @JohnGomm. So effing cool. Like many commenters on King's videos, Gomm is a guitarist himself. But unlike most of those guitarists, Gomm has an extensive YouTube presence. Clicking over to his page shows a slew of lessons and videos, but the clear breakout song is Passion Flower, which topped 20 million views as of 2024. Before I even click play, I am struck by the number. What amazes me about many of the musicians that I encounter in this third path is not simply that they execute their music so effectively, that their personae are so compelling, or that they craft their songs so well. In the context of online abundance, simply winning out over the tremendous mass of competing videos is remarkable. Musicologist Dana Gooley notes the circular causality of live virtuosity in the 19th century, writing of Franz Liszt. He says, on the one hand, Liszt's audiences applaud enthusiastically because he is a great artist. On the other, Liszt is a great artist because his audiences applaud enthusiastically. The same circularity can be found in this third path of online streaming. The musician captures my attention because of their amazing skill. Their skill is amazing because it has captured my attention. Clicking on the video reveals Gomm in a dimly lit studio dressed in all black. a faint spotlight on him, and a slew of petals on the ground at his feet. As he begins, his body contorts and his face reacts to each melodic line. This is the type of bodily commentary on performance so markedly absent from the surface changes. The implicit but obvious message is that he feels this music, every gesture both affirming his connection to the song and guiding my own engagement with it. After an extended, loosely metered introduction, he locks in the tempo as he begins the song's main riff, played entirely in harmonics except for the opening bass note. After I watched the original video, the algorithm surfaces a live clip of Passion Flower from 2023. I'm curious what, if anything, changes in live performance a dozen years later, so I click over. I find a very similar musical execution, but the paratexts are what fascinate me. Consistent with processes of advertification, the description field has become prime digital advertising space that is far too valuable to serve as description. The text links to a guitar magazine holding a fan vote to determine, quote, the greatest acoustic guitar song of all time. Like so many of the superlative statements about virtuosity that I discuss in my book and encounter in scholarship, this one is absurd, as it's based on the idea that listeners can somehow choose a winner from a field that the magazine itself describes as spanning genres and generations, from down-home blues to contemporary fingerstyle. Still, it's a contest that anyone nominated would want to win. So, 30 seconds into the clip, the paratext leaps into the video itself, a call to action in text overlay. Vote now for Passion Flower to win. The in-video prompts keep coming, encouraging me to visit Gomm's website and purchase his wares. I in no way fault Gomm for attempting to benefit from his musical labor and the breakout popularity of this song. But it is striking to me that processes of assetization and advertification, clumsy terms that wear their academic origins on their sleeves and probably should not be spoken out loud. They belong in the book. I've practiced these terms many times. These clumsy terms are not the stuff of abstract theory, but unmistakable components of my streaming experience. Because I have decided to surf the algorithm but turn off autoplay, both videos of Passion Flower become numbers in a variety show that I curate alongside the algorithm, which predictably calls up more impressive guitarists. I click on a clip I had forgotten about, Shredder Steam Vai's duel with the main character played by Ralph Macchio from the 1986 film Crossroads. This is the climactic scene of the film, where Vai serves as the devil's ringer guitarist in a contest with Macchio's character, who is playing to win back the soul of his musical mentor. Multiple commenters on this video claim that Macchio prepared fastidiously to make his fake playing believable, a sort of choreographed cinematic precursor to the virtual virtuosity described by ethnomusicologist Kiri Miller in her discussion of the video game Guitar Hero. I've not bothered trying to confirm this idea, but it demonstrates one of the reasons why I avoid discussing my own experience elsewhere in my project. If you're looking for virtuosity, you can find it almost anywhere. Human labor and its lingering effects surround us. After viewing the Crossroads clip, my recommendations begin to drift into other forms of virtuosity. Three paths stand before me. I can continue watching cinematic presentations of virtuosity, like clips from Amadeus or more Crossroads. I can return to real-life guitar virtuosos, or I can turn to the athletic virtuosity of boxers like Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson. But already, I've run out of time. When I engaged in accelerated fandom, I quickly became aware of King's full-fledged and persistent virtuoso identity. But surfing the algorithm, awash in the endlessness of available content, begins to propagate virtuosity disconnected from any virtuoso. As I click through to each new recommendation, I am deeply impressed by name after name, genre after genre, flourish after flourish. I experience virtuosity, skill made apparent and socially meaningful. And I encounter various iterations of the virtuoso persona, which I theorized earlier in my book as a musician engaged in at least what is perceived as partially unalienated labor. But the sheer number of musicians I watched reduces the likelihood that any of them will begin to acquire, at least for me, anything like a stable virtuoso identity. Rather than becoming more and more acquainted with their artistic personae, accruing details through performance, media, and paratext, the process seems to reverse. The more I stream, the more deeply they recede into general types. In place of their specificity, and much to my dismay, I begin to recall only the broadest identity categories. That Polish guy was impressive. That Japanese girl was amazing. That white kid could really play. My awareness of these identity markers points out another upsetting fact. This ad hoc variety show has quickly become the most homogeneous case study in my book. You all don't know how damning that is because the first case study is 1930s early country music radio programs. Musicians from a huge and unimaginable variety of backgrounds representing diverse musical cultures regularly upload videos to YouTube, and I have found myself digitally surrounded by a narrow group of performers who look and occasionally even sound a great deal like me. It's a humbling reminder of the ways that algorithmic recommendations tend to mirror my interests and identity back to me, encasing me in my own perspective. Social categories and implicit biases we have long known are baked in from the beginning into code and digital platforms such that they appear natural, even innocent. Does YouTube know that I'm a straight, white, temporarily able-bodied, cisgendered man? The answer to this question, as my colleague Benjamin Euler generously pointed out to me, hardly matters. Whether or not the platform has categorized me in this way, it calls out to me through these categories, interpellating me as a subject partially constituted by them. Increasingly, my sense as I navigate these streaming practices is that my subjectivity, to be clear, not just my subject position, but the interest and values at the core of my engagement with the world, is being amplified and projected beyond itself. In the real world, quote unquote, walking to class, driving to the store, talking with a family member, my interest and values originate at what Husserl at one point would have called the subject pole of a phenomenon. But recommendation algorithms increasingly introduce a similar dynamic emanating from the object pole. This doubling up of what were once subjective contributions to experience marks a clear break with the world of non-digital reality or even old media. Trees don't actively work to garner my attention as I walk past them. The words on the page don't rearrange themselves into a new story based on the pace with which I read the previous one. The songs on an LP don't shift their genre based on the albums I listened to yesterday. These are absurd. They sound like silly scenes from a very bad fantasy novel, but they're not all that different from the types of transformations that occur in the background of our streaming practices. To more fully appreciate the significance of this algorithmic personalization, we need to first consider the ways that we are temporally surrounded by values and judgments. They are already on all sides of experience. To make sense of this, I'm going to very briefly reprise Edmund Husserl's account of the basic temporal structures of experience. His key insight is that experience has a certain thickness, such that any experiential moment contains traces of both its recent past, which he talks about as retention, and its near future, protension. This is why I can hear a melody as a unified whole. I recall without actively calling to memory what has just happened and passively generate without actively guessing the likely trajectories based on the retained past and the living present. Similarly, protension and retention are why a simple sentence like, "I went to the store," is easily understood. You all retain the opening, "I went," even as you hear "to the," during which you also passively anticipate or protend likely conclusions to such a statement. These are very straightforward examples, but the upshot of this understanding of lived time is tremendously significant. The tripartite structure of my temporal awareness means that so many of the qualities that characterize any experience actually come before, during, and after what I might consider the actual moment of that experience. The structures of protension and retention mean that all the elements that I identify as central to virtuosity in my work, multiple forms of value, judgments, and intersubjectivity, are on all sides of that experience. This tripartite structure, combined with the algorithmic mirroring of my interests, produces an intensification of values within my streaming experience. I am already temporally awash in these values and interests, and now the medium itself has taken on their tint. Streaming on YouTube or browsing, for example, on TikTok or something else seems to simultaneously scatter my attention while providing algorithmically assisted focus on the aspects of each video that are likely to matter to me. I can dig deeper into a particular artist, topic, or genre, or I can find myself flung to different nodes suggested by the algorithm. If the first happens, what might start as a mild interest can readily become what I've already named as accelerated fandom. In a best-case scenario, this might lead to algorithmically enhanced or even clarified values. In a worst-case scenario, my interests and values are so reified and entrenched that I become incapable of even imagining, much less considering, any other approach. The more I reflect on this, the more I feel a slackening in my valuable connection to each new video. The algorithms carries my concerns for and before me. My subjective contributions to experience subsequently begin to seem less vital. If streaming media sometimes feels tiring or laborious, that may be because it is in fact labor. For media scholars like Kylie Jarrett, digital labor is a capacious category that involves, among other things, both the production and consumption of streaming media. Whether we are actively producing content or passively generating data, we are contributing to the attention economy that extracts value from these activities. Thus, my playful engagement with these videos, which Jarrett admits may be pleasurable and even disalienated for both viewers and content generators, was also an unpaid shift along countless others within deterritorialized attention factories. All that attention I provided also left a trail of data. Today, philosopher Byung-Chul Han reminds me, the clicks we make and the search words we type are stored. Every step is watched and recorded. This is a bit unsettling, but Han goes further. A complete picture of our lives exists on the internet. Our digital habitus provides an extremely precise likeness of our persons, of our very souls. Perhaps it is even fuller and more accurate than the images we otherwise make of ourselves. My immediate reaction to these statements is to recoil. Surely this is grand theory with no place in a phenomenological account. But Han is undoubtedly correct on one point. I forget my streaming habits quickly. The name of a band or an artist, even one that I greatly appreciated, escapes me. If I'm sufficiently motivated, I eventually go searching for it in my browser history or another application. I am forgetful, even of myself and my preferences. The platforms I use are not. I don't necessarily feel like I'm giving up all that much in return for my digital pleasures and conveniences, and that feeling stems from the fact that I provide this data and attention little by little, not in a single rush. Still, this data adds up drip by drip because nothing is lost. We are caught in the total memory of the digital, Han writes ominously. Bentham's panopticon may have seen all, but it didn't record all. Big data, by contrast, Han tells me, never forgets anything. Social psychologist Shoshana Zuboff would hasten to remind us that this is not simply a necessary feature of how the technology functions. The imperative to store and leverage data indefinitely comes from the social and economic logic of surveillance capitalism, not the digital machinery it utilizes. Storing massive amounts of data requires similarly massive investments in energy and infrastructure, and companies take on this enterprise not because it simply must be done, but because it promises to produce further value. Surveillance capitalism, Zuboff tells us, unilaterally claims human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data, which can then be sold on what she calls behavioral future markets, where companies attempt to predict or influence our future behaviors. Surveillance capitalism's concern with experience is not just the what of our engagements, but the how. In staking claim to experience, our very souls, according to Han, these companies are calculating something closer to what Harris Berger theorizes as our stance. If intentionality names the unavoidable phenomenological fact that our consciousness is always in relationship to something, stance names the equally unavoidable fact that that relation is always characterized by aspects of value and style and affect. Now, many would argue that it is simply impossible for algorithms to grasp all the messy humanity of stance. Media scholars, Christian Fuchs and David Chandler, reassure me, quote, computer algorithms cannot understand love, ethics, morals, solidarity, care, affects, and other distinct human qualities. This is comforting at first, but Algorithms have been designed to capture and triangulate my experience, not to understand it. The data conglomerated is meant to build an approximation of my affective and valuable tendencies, my modes of caring and attending to the contents of my experience. In this, the hermeneutic circles of my own experience become part of yet another cyclical process. Call this the algorithmic circle, but now the whole is me. Each click is a part that fleshes out the dataset whole of my subject position and consumer profile that YouTube and its advertisers can use to nudge me along with a soft power that is nonetheless extraordinarily strong. One thing that I am admittedly surprised to find as I surf the algorithm is that I'm engaging in a good deal of comparison. I say this because I said at the outset of this talk and throughout my book that many scholars have overemphasized or misunderstood the role of comparisons in virtuosity. Audiences utilize superlatives to describe musicians all the time, but these statements aren't necessarily evidence of comparative judgments. In fact, they can frequently serve as implicit refusals to gauge in comparison. An audience member exclaims, "She's the best," along with a very silent or quiet, "and I'm considering no further entries." But in online streaming, comparisons seem both more difficult to avoid and more impossible to settle. Watching a video, I can hardly formulate my astonishment. "That's amazing! She's the greatest!" before the algorithm undercuts me and supplies plenty of musicians who seem just as worthy. Practitioners of a given art form may still find a way to settle these comparisons, their better informed aesthetic backgrounds, giving them reasons to stop at a specific musician and find an off-ramp from the potentially endless content. But YouTube recommendations push against this, pestering me as soon as each video ends. "Was that the best guitar playing you've ever seen? What about this, or this, or this?" As I click through to each new video, I realize that immersion via media may not transform viewers into ideal authorities, but the algorithm delivers up a great deal of relevant comparisons that turn my initial amazement into something closer to considered judgment. But the effect, at least in my individual case, is not that of well-grounded aesthetic opinion. Rather than resting in the security of my algorithmically achieved sound judgment, I feel something closer to the malaise that overtook me while searching for housing online during the early days of COVID-19. Preparing to move to a new state during the pandemic meant scrolling through living room after living room, comparing locations, kitchens, and entryways. As I looked at more listings than I'd ever seen in my entire life up to that point, I did not feel my experience welling up in confident parsing of the best from the worst. Instead, I experienced a rather dead-eyed tightening of appraisal, a mild annoyance at the mental toll that it was beginning to take. It seems less than coincidental that the metaphor that leapt to mind for this streaming experience was that of shopping, albeit shopping of a rather consequential kind. As I've discussed, as we all know, commerce is always waiting at the edges of the frame of online experience, even when it's not leaping to the center for an advertisement that we may or may not be able to skip. In the streaming era, the feeling that everything has become an advertisement for some other product, service, or experience is closer to simple fact than paranoid suspicion. But perhaps it is the concept of home that is most salient in this comparison. Zuboff claims that the biggest question of our time is one of belonging. Can human beings find a home in the digital future? Drawn into endless comparison of impressive musicians, I'm reminded again that I don't truly care to find the greatest skill, were such a judgment even possible. I just want something I can relate to, that I can care about, something whose meanings won't be immediately co-opted as fuel for yet another suggestion that quickly overshadows it. As I turn toward my conclusion, I feel compelled to acknowledge again how my own decisions contributed to this process. This experience is not something that the medium simply does. It has its pleasures. Accelerated fandom can be quite fun, its overwhelming aspects balanced by the joy of following a musician like Kaki rapidly across space and time as I build a thickening sense of knowledge and appreciation of her work. In this section, I chose to follow the algorithm, but of course, the algorithm works once, exists to be followed. The choice, like all choices, was made in an uneven dialectic with existing structures, and it realized the risk of alienation inherent in the sheer digital abundance of streaming media. Each meaningful event superseded by another one, the phenomena overlapping in a way too familiar to name. It's more than simple information overload. It's alienation by volume. Philosopher Babbage suggests that scholars frequently engage with critiques of media and mass culture without really believing them for a moment. Or if we do manage to believe them, we think that they apply only to the mindlessly average, not to us. Her assertion is yet another reason why I chose to write this talk in the first person, to force myself to think and speak not of them or even us, but of me. Do I really believe streaming media to structure my experience in such potentially harmful ways? I'd much prefer to side with someone like media scholar Patty Scannell, who concludes his study of mediated experience by taking on foundational social theorists. Classic social theory took a disenchanted view of a world that it found to be disenchanted. It saw modernity as drained of meaning and found it meaningless. An iron cage, a reified world, a world of mass deception. The kind of theory presented here finds the world, particularly the world of broadcasting, as enchanted and enchanting, meaningful and full of meaning. His perspective is undeniably inviting. The magic has come to abide in our homes. Let us not become disillusioned by its constant proximity. Let us rejoice. Returning to my own experience, it seems that Babbage and Scannell may both be right. The world is shot through with meaning, even the mediatized, assetized world of streaming. And at the same time, while I may not fully believe the critiques of mass media and mass culture proffered by Adorno and the like, I don't quite disbelieve them either. I found myself digitally measured and provided with the most comfortable ways to conform and consume. I've encountered in my streaming practices a creeping sense of alienation, a relation of relationlessness, an insidious numbing, that attends my encounter not with any particular video, but with the whole experience in sum. More than a simple contradiction, these two conflicting observations may be structurally intertwined. Channeling Adorno via McLuhan, philosopher Lydia Gurr notes, the more open the medium, the more closed off or reduced the message threatens to become. The seemingly endless array of virtuosities in equally endless domains blurs or threatens to blur into a dull hum of the extraordinary made mundane through its unfailing availability. An excess of excess cancels itself out. The strongest meaning that remains in my experience takes the form of something between pretension, projection, and hope. Put more simply, I am one of those who picks up the guitar after watching an amazing performance rather than wondering if I should pawn it off to more capable hands. It's hard not to be swept up in the desire to be similarly skilled and equally recognized, but it's more than an idle desire for fame or recognition. I want to play that well, to connect to my audience that well. Making these desires explicit allows them to burgeon and leap beyond musical domains. And I recall that the algorithm anticipated this when it began suggesting athletic feats and film stunts alongside musical content. I want to write that well, teach that well, joke that well, dwell in the world with that sense of secure belonging. Paratexts return to me. The true ability in a musician is their ability to inspire others. Increasingly, my sense is that the virtuosities I've experienced here have only been half fulfilled. The first component of the phenomenon occurs, but the second veers somehow off course. I encounter skill made apparent and endlessly appropriated. Skill made apparent and obligatory for survival. Skill made apparent and subsumed under brand identity. My intersubjective encounter with a laboring other becomes a hall of mirrors for my own desires. The remnants of the audio-visual cornucopia from which I have partaken rattle around my mind, seeming to murmur, look what they can do. Just think what you might do. If this seems clearly tied to the types of videos I watched, it's also, according to media theorist Amanda Lagerfist, it springs from the existential character of media. As she says, quote, they throw us and they further call on us to actualize ourselves through them. So I am, once again, thrown. Thrown into a world of seemingly limitless digital abundance that also throws me into awareness of my own limits, of time, attention, energy, and care, even as it goads me into an attempt, or at least desire, to surpass them. Thank you.
I don't know if this is a fully formed question, but I was struck when you said the extraordinary is made mundane by its accessibility or hyper-accessibility.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in virtual spaces and belonging, specifically in disabled communities, where sometimes these virtual spaces are the only areas where that sense of community and kinship is nurtured and created. And so I keep going back to that extraordinary is made mundane by its accessibility, and wondering about the conflict there with accessibility and access to communities that thrive in those digital spaces, and the conflict between the extraordinary becoming mundane because of accessibility.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that question. I have written, I may have spoken incorrectly, I have written availability, not accessibility. I'm not faulting you for hearing, and I may have said accessibility. And obviously those are closely connected.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of it, I've also done work in disability studies and strong proponent of accessibility, to be sure. I'm thinking of it somewhat more differently, not in the sense that like it should be harder to get, but more from the standpoint of, believe it, this is a massive chapter of the book. I cut down a lot. Again, I said, I'll try this and see what happens, and I went, oh dear, I have so much to say. In the full chapter, I talk a lot about the implications, not just of like, oh, it's too easy, but of the lack of any sort of structure around our engagement with things, right? That so many performance traditions have some degree of this sort of classic tripartite, separation and then the liminal phase and the reintegration, right, based off of rituals of transition, right? And I say it's a very strange thing to think about the fact that I do absolutely everything on this thing, right? My whole life courses through this device. So it's not just that I don't have to work hard to do it, but I'm surrounded by literally my whole life is always right there, right? The gesture of most performing arts architecture of whatever style is sort of like something special happens here. And everything that happens here is so intertwined with the most mundane aspects of my life, right? I can go straight from like paying the electric bill into this, right? So I agree, there may be, if there's a tension there, there may be one, I'm not entirely certain, but I'm not thinking of it necessarily from the standpoint of like, we need to be more exclusive. It's more this sort of thing that there is no sort of, it ceases to in any ways have a set-off character. It sort of is swallowed up. I talk a lot in the chapter about whether or not there could be anything like whether or not the concept of like the magic circle has any meaning whatsoever in the digital world, where it's like, what do you mean? This is all of life put together in a totality. There's no separation here. So I'll think more about that. I appreciate the question, but I would say I do not want to in any way say that like we need to erect barriers to this. It's more that there are no structures that in any way set it off in our experience and make it as anything other than just a sort of constant affordance that we might sort of an itch we might scratch. Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, that was an awesome talk. You're really I'm a guitarist as well, and
okay.
I graduated with my bachelor's in 2005. So like the last generation of music students to not have access to YouTube for their whole degree. So I remember when I first ran into Kaki King in like 2006, 2007. I had like the same reaction, I guess, that you're saying. Like, I went and got the tab for playing with Pink Noise. I was so excited. But at that point, I was working on writing a pile of this stuff to perform and play around, and I never ended up posting a lot of it on YouTube because I was sort of disillusioned by just the sheer size of it, how everyone was kind of doing it, and I regret that now. I kind of realized that was foolish of me, but I'm sure there's like a lot of other people that probably felt the same way. But I'm noticing now that there's like a lot of innovation happening. I saw like Matteo Mancuso's name pop up in the little feed. Back when I was into this, like Don Ross, Michael Hedges, Kaki King, Antoine Dufour, these were like the names that were floating around. But now it's like it seems like there's a lot of innovation happening. Is that something that you've looked into? Is sort of how this like accelerated fandom and accelerated fame have sort of pushed people to do new stuff?
Yeah, like so I'm writing about this and thinking about it in general terms, but like I think that judging from the comments, judging from my own experience and everything else, I think this experience of finding these simultaneous as sort of like they're enjoyable and they're sort of prods as well. And the link into this is, as you say, there's a strong link of amateurism into virtuosity, right? That like part of how do you make skill apparent and socially meaningful? Well, there's millions of ways to do it, right? One of them is you can make skill apparent if you have a group of invested amateurs or professionals, frankly, who are watching you and super interested in it. In terms of innovation, right, there's some great players right now. Depends, what mood am I in right now? I mean, sometimes it's easy to feel like it's, if I'm in a negative mood, I'm just a little tired because I talked a lot, it feels like an arms race, right? Which was a really negative framing, but there can be this sense of just like, oh my gosh, we get it, right? We get it. This is spectacular. But the thing is, as I say, like I had this experience. I really, I sat and streamed way more than I talk about here. And truthfully, the experience eventually is just like, I don't know. Like, I focusing on this experience, I'll say, right, obviously, you could absolutely, and in a more traditional mode of scholarship that I would frankly normally work in, would be interested in thinking all about this and like trying to sort of like map out the influences and like who's playing with, who's listening to who, what's happening here, are the fans, like are they choosing sides? Like that's all really interesting to me. Frankly, from this perspective, I don't know how to even address it because the overall feeling was this feeling kind of like, of a bit of a malaise, right? That is like, oh my gosh, I don't actually want to think about who's innovating and who's following. It becomes massively impossible, I think, to truly judge it because it's constantly changing, and there's always a corner that the algorithm hasn't shown you yet, right? And I did this more than once, and each time it was like, oh, how has that not come up before? And like there's the abundance that's on there, and this is part of what I'm talking about, is that even if I was in a positive frame and I wanted to just sort of let's map out the sort of field here. Well, who are the players? What is this whole thing? Very quickly, I don't think it's possible to say, given the amount of amazing players out there, right? Really wonderful people. I don't know that it's possible, in my opinion, to even sort of suss out anything like innovation, or because there's so much happening, and you cannot. Again, have had a lot of experience, and yet we have not watched a meaningful percentage of the excellent players, right, of the professional players on YouTube, right, we've still barely scratched the surface of, which is why I say, really most of us, when we make these judgments, frequently we're judging on ourselves, frankly. Yeah. Even if we're not guitarists, like, this is something that I've heard people say in a lot of contexts, a lot of my case studies. They're thinking about the implicit point of comparison is their own bodies. And that's part of why, even though I look at a lot of forms of virtuosity that are not concerned just with, speed and dazzle, the reason speed is a common marker across genres and cultures is that we all have the experience that our bodies can move really fast or move very precisely, but those two together is hard. and we don't have to think about that long to watch someone, and that's why, you and I have the experience of learning some of these things. Obviously, I've sat down and played some of these compositions that they have, and just sort of like, oh, that's interesting, right? I think there are non-guitarists who are having this experience, and I would say, actually, even given our expertise, I don't know that our judgment can ever be actually grounded, given the abundance. Thank you for the question. I'd love to talk with you more.
All right, so this question is from one of our grad students, Karen Berglander. What role did short form or clipped content such as TikTok or YouTube Shorts play in your experience of each of the three streams, especially when following the third stream? Did following the algorithm also lead to a mirrored experience like the one described with the performers of the advertising and transitional materials bookending the chosen content?
Yeah, so I stuck with YouTube on this because this could have been a wholly separate book, frankly. Maybe it eventually will be. Maybe this is the beginning of it. I'm trying to get the current one out first. Yeah, I'll just say I stuck with YouTube, and so I thought a little bit about TikTok. I read, there's a lot of great scholarship out there right now about TikTok. So I read that and thought about that, and I think a lot of things translate. There's obviously specific affordances, and frankly, it is also just a generational difference that a guitarist under 25, we'll say, just to throw a number out there. A guitarist under 25 is putting out a lot more short-form stuff on TikTok and YouTube Shorts and Reels, whereas guitarists sort of like 30 and older are not, for the most part. So it's one of those things that I saw as a pretty clear generational divide that as folks that are about our age are more likely to be watching Kaki King, Kaki King, she's on other platforms, and likewise with John Gomm, there's a really strong generational shift between when they get in there, and I think probably because of who I started with, because I truthfully did start with King and work through this. It seems that the algorithm, again, who knows, right? But it seems that it likely included my age in that sort of approximation and said, you, man, in your, at that point, late 30s, we will give you what you want, and it won't make you feel weird and like you should be watching this on your phone. What was the end of that question? Because I think there was something I didn't quite catch. It was about the algorithm and like the book ending?
Yeah, the mirrored experience, the one described before, was of the advertising and transitional materials bookending the chosen content.
Okay. Yeah. The mirroring I was thinking about was like that it was really mirroring me, that I was seeing myself in all of this stuff. The way that I will say that the advertisements were frequently, how should I put this? I watched surprisingly few ads during this, which again was somewhat strange. It's part of why I started thinking so much about, and that's not just like I skipped them, but I watched, fewer ads popped up, and I was shown fewer ads than I anticipated I would during a long streaming experience like this. It's part of what made me think a lot about Kylie Jarrett's point about digital labor, because I was kind of going, gosh, why aren't they? I expected to be really, hammered home with the ads, that they were really going to try to get me to go spend some money, and it's when I really realized, and I think I'd read most of her work at that point, or of this particular book I'm drawing on, but it really hit home in my experience that I was like, oh, they don't necessarily have to push the ads as hard as I thought I would find them, because again, I swear, when I teach, it's always the first thing, right? It's like any video I want to show my students has like 5 minutes, and it's always something really strange. But obviously here, go figure, it was happy to just to let me keep doing the digital labor of providing my data, giving my attention, and it's like, yeah, we'll get you later. We'll get you when you're in the classroom, and we'll show you something. But now that you're here, just go ahead. Like you can work in this way, and that's a fine way for us to extract value.
All right, we'll bring in another one of our grad students, Peter Verdin. Could you expand upon the relationship between the assetization of skill on online platforms by creators and the way that such platforms commodify user engagement and attention? It seems that rather than supplanting commodification, the process of assetization complements this commodification of attention and user engagement. Yeah,
so mostly I'll say I agree. It's not the commodification entirely disappears. But this is a kind of surprising thing. Well, it's surprising, and at the same time, if you pay any attention to the sort of classic Silicon Valley business model that has dominated so much of the tech industry, right? The whole goal for a long time is to build a user base and to get attention, and then you lose money maybe for a very long time, and eventually capture a lot of monetary value through either a lot of advertising or subscriptions or something else like that. So I think the point that Jared is making and that I'm pushing on as well is that not that commodification has disappeared. At some point, there is a product that they will want to be sold. But again, even that is not necessarily true, right? The shift has happened in all of our in the practices of streaming, right, if you pay for any premium subscriptions to avoid the ads, you're just renting a library, right? This is again, it is certainly about getting the money, but you are literally paying for access to an asset, a particular digital library, as opposed to purchasing any commodity. So there is that piece of it where like a lot of those commodification, that doesn't quite work because the commodity isn't changing hands. It's the company has leveraged these assets. And again, even all of our, I'm sure many of us remember when you used to actually like own software, and now we all just rent it from the company, right? This is the model. It's even the model of publishers, right? That many academic publishers don't really plan on selling a lot of books. They want to rent their digital collections to libraries, right? So I would agree that for sure, commodification has not disappeared, but it frequently comes later, and these models of the sort of pay for access, I think, are better understood not just as a sort of like twist on commodification, but as a slightly different process that I think assetization is a good way of capturing. Yeah, that's a good question.
One thing that I noticed in your talk, I kept thinking about Emmanuel Levinas, for whom the sight of the other, if you're really paying attention to the other, is this infinite well of different responses that you can't predict. And it almost seems, hearing you talk about our relationship to algorithms, that the algorithms are kind of a false infinite other, where when I attend to you ethically, I see responses I can never predict, and there's, for Levinas, that humanity there, whereas the algorithm gives you infinity, but it's just yourself fed back to you endlessly. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about these different kinds of ethics of infinity in these experiences.
Oh, that is really good, and it's not at all where I thought you were going with it. It took me a second to catch up with you because I really thought I knew where you were going, and that wasn't it. Oh, yeah, thank you, Harry. Let me just talk through that idea for a second. So yeah, like for Levinas, the encounter with the other is, first of all, for him, it is, and I'm just going to assume not everyone, Levinas was my introduction to phenomenology, and it is famously difficult. And as with all famously difficult things, it's easy to make it sound stupid because it's so dense that you boil it down and you're like, wait, that's not it, because this is really important and deep, and I made that sound goofy. So I'll try not to do that here. But for Levinas, the encounter with the other is infinite, not in the sense that in the sense of like, oh, it's an infinite number that goes on and on. His definition of the infinite in Totality and Infinity is, he says, the other infinity overflows the thought that thinks it, right? So that there's no matter what. So it's not just that it's endless and goes on, but that there's always excess, the necessity of excess. And for him, this is not just a sort of descriptive thing, it is a foundational fact. For him, it is the truest thing of human experience. It is first philosophy. So it's really interesting to take this idea, and I do think that it. One of the complaints about Levinas. Oh, Harry. One of the complaints about Levinas from critics is that he really emphasizes my encounter with the other, and he doesn't talk a lot about the encounter of the other, or the other's regard for you, right? Or you as an other within another's experience, right? So it's not necessarily totally symmetrical. I would say that this idea that, so now I'm finally going to get to the question, this idea that somehow that the algorithm is standing as a false other that is giving you an infinity that is actually just you, a sort of like repackaged, mirrored you, I think does capture, I think truthfully, yeah, that's probably a source of my malaise with it, is this feeling that like, oh gosh, because again, I can only truly be another in an other's experience, right? Like, and part of the point of this encounter with the other is to just recognize the fundamental relation that is just there in human being, and that is a constant, for Levinas, it's just a constant source of sort of demand of responsibility and meaning. And I do think that, yeah, that is a really evocative way to capture why it is this feels so bad. I was really leaning into just the abundance of the content that, again, truthfully, I have never forgotten. I'm not good with names, as some of the graduate students can attest. I'm not good with names to begin with. And watching this content, I truly did. I receded into the most basic of like, oh, like that really tall guy played well. Like it was just the most sort of like childish and not the categories. And I think that's part of what it was. It was not just the otherness that was coming from the abundance. It was that truthfully I was not getting an excess that went beyond myself, and that's because, of course, the algorithm can't give this to me. It was a false other that promised, and an interesting way of demonstrating that infinity is different than abundance, right? I could not exhaust the algorithm, but it is not a source of infinity, which is a very interesting point here. Thank you. I hope I didn't lose all of you
That's great.
I really thought that's a question you might give me after the fact, Harry.
Sorry.
No, I love.
Sorry about that.
I love it. You're giving me a long leash. I appreciate it. Just go ahead and talk about Levinas for a while.
I was interested in if your experience with algorithmic mediation of virtuosity, if it made you think differently of virtuosity itself and how common it is. Because to me, virtuosity was, when I was in my undergrad, musicology, Liszt, you talked about Liszt, right?
Yeah.
It was rare, it was pungent, it was once in a generation.
Right.
And now the algorithm tells us it's all around us.
Yeah. Well, and it's not the algorithm. It doesn't just. I don't think that is purely an algorithmic message. Or if it is, the algorithm's right. like the evidence is there, and whatever thing you're super into, if you feel like going through this fever dream, test it out for yourself, and I think you will feel the same thing, which is that, yeah, you're right. The logic of virtuosity as a concept is entirely that it is based on a logic of scarcity, right? Dana Gooley, in his book on Liszt, says that there is this sort of constant need to go further and cross new boundaries. He says that the virtuoso ceases to break new ground, he ceases to be a virtuoso. Okay? And that's definitely how it was thought about, but also as a phenomenologist who just wants to go to experience, I say that is just demonstrably false. Right? And again, this is also James DeVille, when he names the Liszt problem, he also, I have worked with James on something. I did not plant him to write that chapter, although I would have, because I needed a 19th century scholar to name the Liszt problem, so I didn't sound like a jerk 21st century scholar being like, you guys really stink, you gave me a hard thing to deal with. I didn't want to sound like that. But in that same piece, he says part of one strand of the Liszt problem is exactly what I'm doing in my book, which is that we have also, now we've said virtuosity has to be rare, and it's like you have to go further and further and further and further. There's also a lot of scholars who say, apparently completely forgetful of their own experiences, that virtuosity has to be live. It's fundamentally tied to the concert hall. And I just go, I was just blown away by a record I've heard 100 times. So and again, you won't nod because a bunch of you are like, yeah, me too. I have this record and I know what happens, and there's no sense of risk either, which is a common thing. You say there has to be risk that you could fail. The record's there. They're not going to mess it up this time, right? All of these things, and this is why I took a phenomenological approach to virtuosity and media, because there's all these truisms that I think feel sort of intuitively correct. You go, yeah, all this stuff works. And then just as soon as you start going, okay, well, let's actually think about the experience and attend to what happens within it, and you just go, it all falls apart, right? Now you can sort of impose those categories and try to seek them out. But frankly, I mean, this is from the standpoint of disability studies. I squeezed in there a nice little phrase that's used by every person who reads any disability studies. This idea of the temporarily able-bodied person. And frankly, again, many of us have gone and seen, the aging star of whatever type, right? And human beings experience senescence, right? It's not just that we get older, it's that our bodies break down. And none of us are able-bodied forever. And sure, it sounds great. I would like to tell you that I'm getting better and better and better and better and better every day. But at some point, that's just not what happens, right? So it's even this, we go, wow, what a strange fiction to tell ourselves, which is that, one of my case studies is about what I call cosmopolitan virtuosity. I talk about Ravi Shankar and Yehudi Menuhin's collaborations. And Yehudi Menuhin plays to a very old age. And at some point, he does not do some things as well as he used to. He does not lose his virtuoso identity, and people don't cease to be amazed by him. What's happening is that his skill is being made apparent in a different sort of way, and that you're appreciating a whole lifetime, right? You're feeling this sense of like, look at this man who is dedicated decade after decade after decade. And frankly, it's not rare because there is this thing that I have uncharitably called an arms race, and it's common, right, that you see this on social media all the time, and in a lot of things, right? Well, they'll be like, this is what this is what NBA basketball looked like in 1955, and like this is what college basketball looks like today. And in 1955, they're like, and in college basketball, they can all fly, right? And you're just like, well, this is ridiculous. So it's just fundamentally not true, despite the fact that it is internal to the concept. There's one other thing I was going to say about that. Yeah, so I spend a lot of time in the first chapter of the book trying to clear the way for this, and to say again, like, there's a lot of things about 19th century model that comes back by the end of the book. I spend a lot of time not being like, we cannot assume this. This whole idea of the mirroring of the self, this is in a lot of scholarship about the 19th century virtuosity. It's super common, actually. I think by going away from it, though, I'm able to see that it's actually so much more intense for us, given the media structures through which we access these things, right? That it is, as I say, dearly intimate to me. My relationship to this device is rivaled really by nothing else in my life, such that, of course, as I'm watching this thing, I'm thinking about every other part of my life. And it's also... one of the critiques of this, too, is that of virtuosity or of just any need to sort of demonstrate your skill is that, and I gesture to this very, very minimally with the idea of that it being obligatory for survival. There's this question, like, so is virtuosity good or bad? Which obviously we can't answer. It's way too simple of a question. But there's a tendency to want to be like, so wait, do we like this thing? Are we angry at this thing? Which way do we want to go? And it's really hard to answer with virtuosity because in some ways it can be a way of imagining a relationship to your own labor that I think is profoundly productive, maybe even beautiful if I'm feeling sentimental. But also, there's this idea that in our age of precarity, virtuosity is just a necessity, right? I can't, you can't, none of us can afford, none of us get the luxury of just being competent. Right? Like, we all have to be the most astounding specimen that has ever, and it's that type of thing that I think in some ways, I don't think I'm going to like change any hearts and minds with this book, but it's the type of thing that in some ways you realize, you go, oh, like that is not necessarily, like searching for the best whatever on YouTube is just going to drive you nuts. In the same way that like maybe an obsession with virtuosity, which is again difficult because it kind of drives our schools of music, which, and again, there's an inherent, and I will stop with this question. You gave me a good one. Thank you. There's a bit of an inherent contradiction that schools of music are working to deal with, which is this sort of love of rare talent and this desire to educate more broadly, right? If we care about more than just virtuosity as the most narrowly defined thing, then we want to have more than like 7 people in our schools of music. And so it's tricky there. One last thing, I swear. Are there going to be more questions, actually? Because, no, we're done. So this is the last thing. Okay, and then I will be done. Other thing I will say is just that, like, we have so many implicit judgments. The School of Music thing made me think of it too, right? That, like, you judge... There's people who like to think about virtuosity being inherent to, like, a piece or a repertoire too, right? But again, you judge a piece differently by who's playing it, right? The 10-year-old pianist at the recital playing a piece may be the most amazing thing you've ever heard, but the senior recital person or the grad student who plays it is just expected progress, right? Which is, again, why this question is not about superlatives, about the best, about it being rare. It's just about, does the skill matter in this frame enough for me to attend to it and for it to take on some meaning? So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.